The city lights had never felt like mine. I used to stare at them from my office window, shimmering, relentless, promising success if only I stayed a little later, worked a little harder, sacrificed a little more. But the higher I climbed in corporate marketing, the more hollow it felt. I wasn't building anything. I was polishing brands for people who already had everything. So I left. Walked out with my final bonus check and a head full of plans no one believed in except me. Wilder Ridge was nothing like the city, and that was the point. Tucked along a silver-blue lake, it was more postcard than place. Chipped paint on charming porches, weeping willows along the shoreline, and shop signs hand-painted with care. The air even smelled like cedar and stories. I rented a little cottage near the edge of town and gave myself 3 months to figure out what was next. That's when I saw the table. It was tucked behind a dusty window on Main Street, beneath a crooked sign that read Alden Custom Woodworks. The table was raw, unvarnished, and absolutely stunning iron hairpin legs, reclaimed oak with a live edge, just the right balance of rugged and refined. It looked like it had something to say. I stepped inside. Grayson Alden was taller than I expected, with sawdust on his flannel sleeves and calluses that told me he worked with his hands, not just posed with them. His workshop smelled of linseed oil, coffee, and the quiet intensity of someone who lost hours inside his craft. He spoke sparingly, like each word had to earn its place, but his work shouted. "I don't advertise," he said flatly when I asked about commissions. "Word gets around." That much was obvious. But the showroom was barely functioning. No pricing sheets, no website, no branding beyond a scribbled logo on his invoices. He was a master craftsman hiding in plain sight, and something about that injustice lit a fire in me. "I can help," I offered, not out of pity, but because I knew exactly what he had, raw talent. The kind that needed someone who could translate it to the world. "You build. I'll tell your story." He didn't say yes right away. He didn't say much of anything. But a week later, I showed up with a portfolio, a plan, and a promise. We'd name the business Elm and Iron. Strong, natural, elevated. Rustic design with upscale branding. We'd redesign the logo, launch a site with curated photography, and streamline the commission process. He blinked slowly, then nodded once. What started as a collaboration turned into long nights side by side, me at my laptop refining brand guides, him carving patterns into walnut slabs. Music played low, and sometimes we didn't even speak. But there was a rhythm between us, like dovetail joints locking into place. We launched officially 3 months later. Elm and Iron was everything we hoped, a boutique brand rooted in authenticity. We didn't chase trends, we curated heirlooms. The orders rolled in from cities nearby, then states away. Design blogs took notice. I handled clients, curated the messaging, brought in contracts from interior designers and restoration groups. Grayson handled the builds, and for the first time, his work reached the audience it deserved. Somewhere in that steady growth, something shifted. We laughed more. Cooked together. Went from working late to staying over. I never expected to fall in love with a man who barely used email, but I did. And when he asked me to marry him on the lake dock, with a ring carved into a rosewood box he'd made himself, I said yes without hesitation. We married that fall in a ceremony as simple as it was perfect. Just us, close friends, the lake, and a hand-finished arbor he built from old barn beams. I wore a linen dress. He wore his favorite flannel. The vows we wrote were short, but deeply true. We were partners in business, in love, in life. Afterward, I officially became co-owner and business manager of Elm and Iron. We moved into a larger studio space with room for his tools and my office. I ordered business cards that read, Marina Kellis Alden, co-owner and creative director. Every detail, down to the recycled paper, was deliberate. We weren't just building furniture. We were building something that mattered. In those early days, it felt like magic. We'd wake up tangled in each other, make coffee, and go create something beautiful. I'd run numbers while he sketched new ideas. Sometimes we disagreed, but always found our way back. We were different in all the right ways. His silence grounded me. My vision elevated him. We celebrated our first feature in a regional design magazine with wine on the workshop floor, laughing under Edison bulbs and the scent of varnish. I remember thinking, this is what it means to be in alignment with your purpose, your partner, your life. I believed we were unshakable. I believed we'd only keep growing. I didn't know then that something could look so solid and still have cracks beneath the grain. But for now, we were whole. Elm and Iron was thriving. And I, for the first time in a long time, felt like I belonged to something I helped shape. Every edge smoothed, every detail chosen, every dream built from the ground up. At first, the changes were so small I almost missed them. Grayson started closing the workshop door more often, telling me he needed focus time, which was fine. I understood creative flow. But then came the missed meetings, the unanswered emails, the invoices he forgot to sign off on. When I gently remind him, he'd sigh like I was pestering him, like I was some overbearing administrator instead of his wife and business partner. I brushed it off. People hit plateaus. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the pressure of our fast growth was just catching up to him. I offered to hire an extra hand, someone to help with the builds so he could focus on design. That's when he mentioned her. Sophie Halen, he said one night over dinner. Fork paused midair. Local. Studied design. Young, but gets it. I've already had her in for a few pieces. I raised an eyebrow. You brought someone on without telling me? It's my workshop, he said flatly. She's just assisting. Nothing formal. There was something in his tone, dismissive, territorial, that pulled tight in my chest. But I let it go. I told myself it was just a communication hiccup. Still, I started checking the schedule more closely, noticing the frequency of her visits. How her name kept showing up on supply orders. How Grayson became even more closed off, even irritable, when I asked basic questions. Then, one morning, I opened the office laptop and found the receipts, 2 separate charges at a boutique wine bar in town, both under his business card, both on weekdays during work hours. I stared at the screen, the numbers blurring. My stomach turned cold. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the unease. So I looked further, even though a part of me didn't want to know. And that's when I saw them. Flirty texts saved on the cloud. You looked hot in that apron today, and when she's gone, let's take the long way home again. My breath caught, my fingers trembling on the trackpad. I waited until he came home, late, smelling like sawdust and something sweeter, something that wasn't mine. He tossed his keys on the counter like it was any other night. I held up my phone, face blank. You want to explain these? He barely flinched. Didn't deny them. Just leaned against the counter and folded his arms, like I was overreacting. You're digging through my stuff now? Don't twist this. You've been seeing her, haven't you? He exhaled, slow and heavy. It's not what you think. Oh, so it's not infidelity, just casual betrayal? My voice cracked, heat flooding my cheeks. You've been controlling everything, he snapped. You act like Elm and Iron's your brand now. Maybe if you weren't always buried in spreadsheets, you'd notice I needed space. Space? You needed space so badly you climbed into bed with your assistant. He smirked, actually smirked. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with power, we'd still be fine. And just like that, it flipped. I became the villain. The power-hungry, cold-hearted woman who dared to professionalize the dream we built together. It didn't matter that I designed the entire brand, negotiated every vendor contract, brought in over half our client base. To him, I was just the woman who turned his sanctuary into a business, and now the woman who had the audacity to be angry about a betrayal. I left that night. Took only my laptop, a duffel bag, and the silence between us. I stayed in the guest room of a friend's bed and breakfast down the road, unsure if I should cry or scream or go completely numb. 2 days later, I got served. Grayson had filed for divorce and demanded sole ownership of Elm and Iron. Claimed I had no substantial contribution to the artistic value of the business. Said he'd built it long before Marina ever showed up with her marketing plans. He wanted the name, the assets, the client lists. Everything. I stared at the paperwork, heart thudding like a war drum in my chest. It wasn't just personal now. He was trying to erase me professionally too. Rewrite the narrative to cast me as the meddling wife who wrote in on a whiteboard and left with the credit. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I hired a lawyer, Simone Trask, sharp as glass and twice as clear. She didn't flinch when I laid it all out. The branding strategies, the growth analytics, the emails proving my management. He picked the wrong woman to underestimate, she said, eyes like steel. Grayson didn't know who he was dealing with. He thought love meant silence. That if he pushed hard enough, I'd vanish back into the shadows of his workshop. But I had spent years making other people's dreams visible. This time, I'd fight for my own. I looked around the empty cottage, the scent of sawdust still lingering in my suitcase. The man I married wasn't who I thought he was. And the business we built? He might have shaped it with his hands, but I shaped it with everything else. He was trying to cut me out. But he'd forgotten one thing about wood. Grain remembers. Even under polish. Even through fire. And so do I. The courthouse in Wilderidge was a squat, sandstone building that looked more like a schoolhouse than a place where dreams were fought over in front of strangers. The morning of the hearing, I wore navy. Not black. I didn't want to dress like I was mourning something. I wanted to look like someone who was very much alive. My lawyer, Simone, walked beside me like a shadow with bite. She had her hair slicked back and her binder of evidence tucked beneath one arm, as confident as if we'd already won. Grayson arrived late. Of course he did. He strolled in wearing the same gray shirt he wore to our third client consultation, sleeves rolled to the elbows like he wanted the court to see the hardworking artisan image he'd always clung to. His lawyer, Ben Redding, was younger, sleeker, probably thought this would be easy money. I watched them confer briefly before Vin turned and actually winked at me. Simone saw it too. Charming, she muttered. Inside the courtroom, the air was dry and thick with silence. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp cheekbones and tortoiseshell glasses, looked like she'd seen enough family drama to fill a bookshelf. We didn't get theatrics. No grand speeches. Just questions, documents, and the simple, brutal business of division. Grayson's argument was exactly what we expected, dismissive, condescending, built around the idea that craftsmanship equaled ownership. He painted himself as the soul of Elm and Iron, the visionary whose raw talent had been burdened by unnecessary business interference. Me? I was support staff. An administrative aide with no real creative input. I didn't react. I sat still, legs crossed at the ankle, listening to him recite half-truths and omissions as if they were gospel. He was so polished, so sure of himself, right until Simone stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she handed over documentation, emails showing I had brokered our first major deal with a Chicago interior firm. Branding guides with my name on the drafts. Records showing a 300% increase in profits after I joined. Screenshots of our website with content written in my voice, interviews I secured, designs I approved. A full marketing plan, broken down by quarter, annotated and signed by both of us. And then, finally, the client testimonials. I had reached out to each of them myself. I didn't need them to take sides. I just asked them to speak truthfully. Every single one credited me with their decision to choose Elm and Iron. When Simone rested, the silence in the room stretched long enough for me to count my own heartbeats. Grayson sat stone-faced, but I could see his jaw working beneath the veneer. Vin leaned in and whispered something to him, probably trying to salvage what was left of their argument. But the damage was done. The judge turned to Grayson and asked, "Mr. Alden, why did you not disclose these contributions in your filings?" He said nothing. She repeated herself, firmer this time. Still nothing. And then, quietly, the judgment came down. Equal contribution. 50-50 division of the business and its assets. Marina Kellis retains co-ownership of Elm and Iron. Just like that, the gavel came down and it was over. Outside the courthouse, I stepped into the sunlight like it was the first real breath I'd taken in weeks. Simone shook my hand and told me to go celebrate. She had other cases, other fires to put out, but she paused just long enough to add, "He thought you were going to cry." Instead, you buried him in facts. As she walked away, I saw Grayson standing near the edge of the lot, shoulders tight, hands in his coat pockets. He caught my eye and walked toward me, expression smug despite what had just happened. Vin trailed a few steps behind, still scrolling on his phone like the outcome wasn't worth his attention. "You'll never make it without me," Grayson said, low and bitter. "The clients came for the work." "My work." I met his eyes without flinching. "And they stayed for the experience I created." Vin chuckled, like I'd told a joke. "Just a matter of time before you fail," he said, brushing imaginary lint off his lapel. "You don't have the name. You don't have the legacy." I didn't respond. There was no point arguing with men who thought noise was the same as substance. Instead, I walked past them, keys already in my hand, resolve burning quietly inside my chest. I had fought for what I built. And I'd won, not just in court, but in the mirror. I hadn't let them erase me. They thought I'd crumble. Thought I was soft because I cared about beauty, about legacy, about telling a story that mattered. But the truth was simpler than that. They forgot one thing. You cannot build a woman who knows how to rebuild herself. And I was just getting started. I signed the lease on the new space with ink that didn't even feel dry before I began sketching the layout. Light. That's what I wanted. Light through big street-facing windows, filtered through linen curtains, and softened across honey-toned wood. It wasn't just about furniture, it was about feeling. The way a room could make someone inhale easier, remember something they'd forgotten. I wanted that sense of rooted comfort, that quiet reverence for stories etched into grain and brass. I wanted to build a business where elegance didn't shout, it whispered. I called it Hearth and History. No reclaimed iron, no masculine edge, no trying to keep up with what Grayson used to build. I didn't need to rebrand Elm and Iron, I needed something entirely new. Something mine. I wrote the tagline one evening at the little kitchen table in my rental cottage, where legacy is restored by hand. It made my heart swell. Because that's what I was really doing, giving forgotten pieces new breath. The day I opened the studio, I lit a candle on the corner shelf, lavender and clove, and stood in the center of the room just breathing it in. The walls were painted a warm cream, accented by natural pine shelving and vintage gold-framed mirrors. It felt like a space that had always existed, like I'd simply uncovered it. I didn't advertise. Not loudly. Just a modest website, carefully worded. A few social media posts with detailed captions, not polished ads. I knew the kind of clients I wanted, those who cherished meaning over flash. And slowly, they found me. At first, it was a couple restoring their grandmother's rocking chair. Then a bed and breakfast owner who wanted staging help for a 19th century suite. Then a museum curator seeking someone to refinish a Victorian tea cart for a heritage exhibit. I didn't poach. I didn't chase. I let the work speak. And I didn't do it alone. I hired Arden first. She'd graduated from Wilderidge Design Academy just 6 months earlier, quiet but observant, always running her fingers along the undersides of drawer joints to check craftsmanship. She reminded me of myself, only more precise, more hungry. Then came Lila, exuberant and bold, with a keen eye for textiles and a laugh that carried down the hall. Together, we formed an unlikely trio, focused, driven, and completely committed to detail. I didn't want employees. I wanted collaborators. We started with 2 pieces a week, then 4. Then I had to buy a scheduling calendar big enough to stretch across the wall. There was no flash, no signature scent, no slick showroom with fake props. Just us, our hands, our eyes, and wood that asked for patience. Arden handled restoration, delicate sanding, gold leaf repairs, stabilizing fragile joints. Lila curated the finishing touches, sourcing antique drawer pulls, period-accurate paint tones, hand-woven runners. I managed design, sourcing, and clients, but I still kept my sleeves rolled, often working side by side on custom inlays or historical research. Each piece was a chapter, and we treated it as such. The name began to carry weight faster than I expected. One by one, clients told friends. A boutique in Greendale called to ask about a commission for their historic hotel. A local magazine left a message requesting an interview. The studio buzzed with work and warmth, and for the first time in a long while I felt safe. Not safe as in quiet, but safe as in steady. Anchored. No one here was trying to overshadow or outmaneuver me. We had a rule. Every project started with a story. Not a mood board or a trend report, a story. Who owned the piece? Where had it lived? What did they remember about it? I wanted those details to guide every brushstroke, every polish. It became our signature, really. Clients started telling us their furniture's backstories like we were biographers. I listened to them the way no one had listened to me in that courtroom. I didn't realize how much I had needed this space not just to rebuild, but to redefine. Of course, I heard whispers about Grayson. You couldn't live in a town like Wilderidge and not hear things. He had renamed Elm and Iron to the Alden Workshop, a name that felt stripped of soul. I saw the new logo one afternoon on a delivery van outside the grocery store. Stark black lettering, minimalist and cold. A poor attempt at reinvention. I didn't linger on it. Until one afternoon, a woman walked into the studio, clutching something wrapped in a bedsheet. She introduced herself as Caroline Rhodes, former Elm and Iron client. Inside the bundle was a hall bench oak, but warped. The edges were unfinished, one side cracked from pressure, the finish bubbling like it had been sealed in haste. I asked him to recreate my grandmother's bench, she said, eyes glassy. This isn't even close. I heard you were the one who used to make things right. I looked down at the piece. There was beauty under the damage. We can fix it, I told her. We'll take care of it properly. And then came the next message. And the next. Slowly, my inbox filled, not with sales, but apologies. Clients who had followed Grayson's name now sought out mine. They weren't looking for a refund. They were looking for someone who still gave a damn. Still, I didn't gloat. I didn't reach out. I simply documented the damage, wrote polite responses, and did the work. That was always the difference. He performed craftsmanship. I honored it. And that was something no rebrand could fake. The first time I saw the Alden Workshop's new storefront, I was driving home with Arden after sourcing materials from the estate sale of a historic lake house. We passed by the window where a garish, modern rustic fusion sign stretched across the glass in bold, sterile font. It was all stark metal stools and minimalist frames, nothing like the warmth that had once defined Elm and Iron. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just exhaled quietly and kept my hands steady on the wheel. But the signs of unraveling were everywhere, if you knew where to look. Grayson had raised prices by nearly 30% overnight, pricing out the very clients who had built our business in the first place. The social media he never used before was suddenly overflowing with posts, sleek, shallow, filled with buzzwords and sponsored hashtags. Bespoke, elevated, artisan forward. It all rang hollow. I knew his work, knew the soul it used to carry. And I could see, plainly, when that soul had started to fracture. Still, I stayed focused on hearth and history. We had more projects than we could handle and had to start booking 3 months out. Arden took on a museum restoration in the next town over, while Lila began curating period pieces for a local bed and breakfast that wanted a full vintage rebrand. Our studio pulsed with momentum. There was never any time to gloat, just enough to keep our heads down and build. But then the messages started. First, it was a gentle inquiry from a woman named Dana. She'd commissioned a dining table from Grayson 6 weeks prior. It had arrived chipped on one end and bowed in the center. He told me to sand it myself, she wrote. Is that normal? The next was more direct. Marina, I don't want to stir anything up, but I paid nearly $5,000 for a sideboard that arrived smelling like varnish and still wet to the touch. Can you take a look? And then another. And another. Each one a variation on the same theme, something beautiful promised, something broken delivered. I started a folder in my inbox labeled Alden Damage. I didn't respond emotionally, I just logged each complaint, documented everything, and quietly offered assessments where I could. I wasn't interested in lawsuits. I was interested in accountability. One afternoon, I sat with a woman named Ruth on a velvet bench in the studio, studying the fractured drawer of what was supposed to be a 1920s apothecary cabinet. The dovetail joints didn't even match. "I just wanted to feel like it used to," she said softly. "He told me he could do that." I nodded. "You trusted him with a memory. You deserve better." I didn't charge her full price. I couldn't. There was something sacred in fixing what someone else had ruined, especially when that someone was the man who used to share my bed, my business, my vision. Meanwhile, Grayson's reviews online started dipping. A few one-star comments, poor craftsmanship, rushed delivery, didn't respond to issues, peppered his once pristine record. I never commented, never posted, never reached out. But one night, I caught sight of a post on a Wilderidge community board. "Anyone know a good restorer? We made the mistake of going with Alden Workshop and now we need someone to fix the fix." That's when I realized it wasn't just splinters. It was collapse. Grayson had always needed chaos to feel in control. Where I built systems, he resisted them. Where I sought clarity, he hid in ambiguity. Now, without me, he was left with only half the house we'd built, and he'd chosen to tear it apart rather than admit I'd held up more than he ever gave me credit for. I got a text from Arden one morning. "Another Alden piece just came in. Nightstand with peeling veneer. Want me to triage?" I smiled. "Yes, thank you. You know the drill." And we did. Every failed delivery of his was an opportunity to prove what integrity looked like. Not spite, craftsmanship. We did our work in the open. And that light, that quiet trust, it spread. One evening, after closing, I stood in the middle of the studio and just looked around. Every corner held proof, sketches pinned up on corkboards, with samples tagged with client notes, pieces mid-restoration waiting for their second chance. We weren't fixing Grayson's failures. We were reclaiming stories from the wreckage. And yet, I knew him well enough to feel it coming. The pressure. The backlash. He wouldn't go down quietly. Not Grayson. But I also knew myself now in a way I hadn't before. When I looked at the studio walls, I didn't see Grayson's shadow. I saw my fingerprints. My vision. My name. He once told me that without him, I wouldn't know where to begin. But what he didn't understand, what he never could, was that I'd already begun. I was miles ahead. And he was still trying to find the map. The first time I heard Grayson's voice again, it wasn't in person. It was on speakerphone. Lila and I were unboxing a shipment of antique brass fixtures when my cell rang, unknown number, but I recognized the tension in the silence after I answered. "Then, you really think you can take everything from me and just walk away?" I didn't respond. My thumb hovered over the end call button, but I let the silence speak first. "You stole my clients. You're spreading lies. Don't think I don't know what you're doing." Click. No yelling, no reply. I blocked the number. I wanted to believe that would be the end of it. But Grayson had always been the kind of man who mistook losing control for being wronged. The more his grip slipped, the more convinced he became that someone else had loosened it on purpose. So he did what people like him do. He lashed out. Not with evidence, but with venom. The first report came from a former client who now worked with me. "He called," she said, nervously twisting her wedding ring. "Said you were inconsistent, that you'd ruined his business and were trying to sabotage his name." I took a deep breath. "Did you believe him?" She shook her head. "No. I believed what I saw you do with my grandmother's hope chest." He just sounded desperate. After that, the calls multiplied. He started reaching out to anyone who posted about hearth and history. DMs, emails, even cold calls. Always the same message. I was manipulative. Dishonest. Out to destroy what he'd created. He even started hinting that I'd stolen designs, repurposed his old blueprints, even though every single service I offered was entirely different from what we'd done at Elm and Iron. At first, I was furious. Then I was just exhausted. But I knew better than to play offense in the open. Instead, I opened a file. A neat, time-stamped, well-documented folder that included every report, every message, every screenshot sent to me by clients or vendors. I didn't respond to Grayson. I responded to the truth. Quietly, methodically, like a woman with nothing to hide and everything to protect. Then came the article. A writer from Ridgestyle Quarterly had been following our progress since the launch. I'd initially declined an interview, not wanting publicity that felt like a spotlight on a feud. But she returned, months later, with a new angle. "This isn't about rivalry," she said. "It's about craftsmanship. Your work speaks for itself, and it's making waves in preservation circles." This time, I said yes. The feature came out in early spring. A full-page spread of the studio, photos of Arden restoring a barley twist leg, Lila arranging hand-embroidered linens on a freshly refinished vanity. There was a photo of me too, standing by the window, sleeves rolled, hands dusted with pigment. The headline read, "Rooted Beauty, How Hearth and History is Reviving Wilder Ridge's Past, One Piece at a Time." They quoted my philosophy: every piece carries a memory. We don't just restore furniture, we restore meaning. My phone lit up for hours after the article dropped. Not just from clients, but from strangers, vendors, designers, even curators. People who saw what we were doing and wanted to be part of it. That week, our inquiry form crashed from the number of submissions. We tripled our commissions list. I had to call in a contractor to expand the backroom workspace just to keep up. I should have felt nothing but joy, and I did. Mostly. But I also knew what would come next. The morning after the article released, I stepped out front to find a strip of sandpaper nailed to the studio's wooden sign. Just hanging there. No note. No vandalism. Just a message only I would recognize. A threat in the form of a tool. I took it down without a word. Arden watched me from the doorway. "Do you want to call someone?" she asked gently. "No," I said. "Let him exhaust himself. He always does." The truth was, I wasn't scared of him, not in the way I used to be. I had faced worse than gossip and veiled intimidation. I'd lived through being erased, being underestimated, being loved conditionally, only as long as I stayed small. Now, I wasn't just standing, I was building. With every piece, every repaired heirloom, every woman I employed, I laid another brick in a life that no longer had space for him. I knew the power of reputation. But more than that, I knew the power of consistency. Grayson could rant. He could call. He could even try to mimic my branding again if he wanted. But the difference was in the doing, and I never stopped doing. That week, a client dropped off a mirror with a note tucked inside the crate. "I followed your story. And now, I trust your hands with mine." That was all I needed to keep going. Grayson was ash and smoke, flickering, desperate, already burning out. But me? I was firewood cured and ready. Quiet, steady. Built to last. The email came on a Tuesday. The subject line read, "Offer to discuss terms." No hello, no preamble. Just an attached document from Grayson's new lawyer, who had replaced the smug, useless Finn Redding with someone even colder, Clara March, a name I recognized from big city firm rosters. She didn't bother with pleasantries either. The language was clinical, strategic, and absurdly bold. Grayson was offering to sell his remaining half of Elm and Iron to me, at double its appraised value, and, as a cherry on top, wanted a non-compete clause that would bar me from offering any furniture design services within a 200-mile radius for the next 10 years. I stared at the screen, blinking slowly once, twice. Then I laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was the kind that bubbles up when you realize someone still, somehow, thinks you're naive enough to fall for the same tricks twice. He wanted to offload the husk of a business we'd built together, after dragging my name, my work, and my vision through the dirt, and he thought I'd pay him for the privilege? I forwarded the email to Simone, who responded within minutes. "He must be bleeding cash. We can ignore or issue a formal rejection. Your call." I chose the latter. I had no intention of entertaining games, but I wanted it documented that I didn't flinch. I responded professionally, unemotionally. "The offer is declined. Terms are neither reasonable nor reflective of market value or professional reality." That was it. Clean. Final. No room for him to twist my words into some personal slight. 2 days passed. Then 3. And then Grayson showed up. I was in the middle of reviewing finished samples with Arden and Lila when I heard the bell above the door. I didn't have to turn around. I knew that silence, that tension, that presence that always felt like it took up more room than it should. He still had a way of making everything around him feel brittle. "Marina," he said. Just my name, no greeting. My team froze, instinctively shifting closer like a wall forming without discussion. I stood steady. Grayson. He looked worse than the last time I saw him. His beard was unkempt, his shirt rumpled like it had been plucked off the floor. His eyes were shadowed, not tired, but hollow. I waited for him to speak, arms crossed gently over my chest. "I need you to come back," he said finally. His voice was low, frayed around the edges. "It's falling apart." I nodded once. Not in agreement, just acknowledgement. "Yes, it is." He stepped forward, and Arden moved slightly, subtly, between us. He noticed. His face flickered with something hurt, maybe. Or ego bruised at no longer being the center of the room. "I know I messed things up," he said. "You don't have to say it. But we were good once. Weren't we?" "We were," I answered honestly. "Before you made me invisible in my own story. Before you chose ego over partnership." He swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. "It's not the same without you. Clients don't respond. The pieces don't feel right. I can't," he paused, blinking fast. "I can't do it like you did." "No," I said softly, "you can't. Because I didn't just make things look good. I made people feel seen. I brought heart to it. And you mistook that for decoration." He looked down at the floor like it might give him something to say. "I'm offering you a way out," he tried again. "Take it. Buy it. Make it yours again." I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch. "I already have something that's mine," I said, gesturing gently to the room around us. "Look around, Grayson. This isn't just survival. It's growth. Purpose. Legacy." He blinked at the word, legacy, like it stung. Like he'd only just realized it wasn't something he could build alone. "I don't want to fight anymore," he whispered. I need to move on." "So do it," I said. "But don't do it here. Don't bring your smoke and ruin into this space and expect to find something you can still claim." He looked like he might say something else. But then he just stood there, shoulders sagging, caught in the weight of all the things he'd broken. "You said I'd never make it without you," I reminded him. "And yet, here I am." He opened his mouth, closed it. Then, quietly, he turned and walked out the door. I watched until he disappeared down the street. And when I turned back to my team, they didn't say a word. They didn't need to. We returned to work like nothing had happened. Because for us, it hadn't. Grayson was the past. This was the future. And I was exactly where I needed to be. The envelope arrived by courier, thick and overly formal, like it was trying to dress up desperation in legalese. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. But I did, right there at my studio desk, the morning light spilling in through the window, a mug of coffee growing cold beside me. The words inside weren't surprising, not really. Still, reading them aloud to myself felt surreal. Grayson Alden was suing me. The claim? That Hearth and History was a direct copy of Elm and Iron. That I had appropriated core design models, branding identity, and client strategies from our previous joint venture. According to him, I hadn't just left, I'd stolen the soul of his business. I laughed once, short and sharp. It wasn't that it didn't hurt, because it did. Another attempt to erase what I'd built, another effort to drag me back into the shadows of his need for control. But it was also pathetic. The business he'd let rot through arrogance and carelessness was now the blueprint for mine? "Please." I called Simone immediately. "Let him file," she said without hesitation. "We'll bury this thing, in fact." And that's exactly what we did. Over the following weeks, we assembled every shred of evidence needed to make it plain. Hearth and History was its own creation, built on a foundation of restoration, not fabrication. The service model was entirely different. We didn't mass-produce custom orders. We restored existing heirlooms and provided bespoke design services for historical properties. The branding wasn't rustic industrial, it was heritage-inspired, leaning into history, emotion, storytelling. The client base? Separate, documented, and, in several cases, new patrons who'd arrived solely due to my published work or word of mouth unrelated to anything we built together. We had timelines, contracts, design plans, a business model built from scratch, and most damning of all, we had testimonials. Clients came forward unprompted. They wrote letters, some handwritten, others emailed. They spoke of how they'd turned to me only after Grayson's work arrived damaged, unfinished, or simply wrong. One letter from a couple in New Haven said it best: "We hired Grayson because we believed in the legacy of Elm and Iron. But it was Marina's vision that made that legacy matter. When it fell apart, she's the one who helped us restore it." The hearing was scheduled quickly. Grayson had pushed for an emergency injunction to stop us from taking on new clients. Simone was ready. In court, she didn't posture or perform. She laid out the evidence like puzzle pieces snapping into place. Distinct logos, registered trademarks. Side-by-side marketing comparisons. Photos showing our restoration process, a far cry from the furniture factory feel of the Alden workshop. Then came the testimonials. We brought in 3 clients to speak on record. They told the judge, clearly and calmly, that my services weren't a duplication of Grayson's, they were the correction. They described rushed pieces, flaking paint, splintering corners. They described my studio as the place they came to when they needed someone who actually listened. When Grayson took the stand, his voice was raw. He looked tired again, the polished charm gone. He spoke of betrayal, of creative theft, of a business ripped from his hands. But when the judge asked him to produce a single piece of concrete evidence tying my business model to his, he faltered. "No," he finally muttered. "Not in writing." The judge removed her glasses. "Mr. Alden, this court is not interested in bruised egos. It is interested in facts. And your claim has not met the standard." She turned to her clerk and issued a ruling, motion to dismiss. Not only that, she ordered Grayson to cover all legal fees. And then, with a sharp sigh, she looked back at him one last time. "You are not the first man to underestimate a woman's contribution to shared success," she said. "But if you thought dragging her into court would hide your failure, let me assure you, it's done the opposite." I didn't look at him when it ended. I didn't need to. As I walked out of that courthouse, a strange mix of emotions swirled in me. I wasn't giddy. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just free. I stood on the steps for a moment, the wind stirring around me. The town stretched ahead, cobbled sidewalks, storefronts glowing with late spring light, the steady rhythm of a place that had become mine. Simone clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You're good," she said. He played the last card in a losing hand. And that was it. He tried to sue away my identity. And in the process, he'd cemented it. Back at the studio, I stepped into the workroom where Lila was smoothing lacquer across a queen and side table. She looked up, searching my face for a sign. "Dismissed," I said. "We're clear." Arden hooped from across the room, a rare outburst from her usually composed self. We didn't celebrate with champagne. We didn't take the day off. We went back to work. Because that was the point. I didn't need to destroy him to prove I could thrive. I just needed to keep creating. And he couldn't sue that out of me, not ever. The sign went up faster than I expected, bold red letters taped to the inside of the once proud showroom window. Eviction notice, property seized by Wilderidge County Bank. I parked across the street, engine idling, more out of habit than curiosity. I hadn't driven there on purpose. I'd been heading to the antique mill on Elm when I turned the corner and saw it, the final punctuation mark in a story that had unraveled itself. The building looked empty, hollowed out. The hand-painted sign that once bore the Alden workshop had been removed, leaving only 4 holes in the wood where it used to hang. A few stray wood shavings littered the sidewalk, caught in the wind like remnants of a broken promise. The windows were bare. The inside stripped of inventory. Just echoes and dust where once there'd been saws, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of hands on oak. He'd tried to hold it together, I knew that. I'd heard from vendors around town that his payments were months overdue. Suppliers had stopped taking his calls. Custom orders had gone unanswered, then delayed, then refunded under pressure. Clients posted online, missing pieces, warped finishes, full deposits paid, and nothing delivered. And then his employees began to vanish. First was Jordan, his shop apprentice. He came into Hearth and History one morning, hat in hand, asking if we had space for part-time help. Grayson hasn't shown up in days, he admitted. I loved working with wood, but it's like the place doesn't even have a heartbeat anymore. We didn't have room for more hires at the time, but I told him I'd write him a letter of recommendation. Something told me he wouldn't need it. People in town were paying attention. Then came the rumors about Sophie's father, the investor Grayson had leaned on when things first started slipping. A wealthy man with no patience for failure and less patience for scandal. The day after the lawsuit was dismissed, word spread that the funding had been pulled. Not publicly, of course. But in a town like Wilderidge, news moves on breath. I never reached out. Never gloated. I let the fallout unfold without interference. Still, there was something heartbreaking about seeing it like this. As much as I wanted to distance myself from what we'd once shared, the truth was this building had been part of a dream. We'd stood inside it when it was just an empty workshop, our breath fogging in the cold, envisioning it filled with light, with creation, with legacy. We'd chosen the layout together. I'd drafted the first logo at the back table. I'd stood by the counter 6 years ago and kissed him after we signed our first contract. That wasn't something I could pretend hadn't mattered. But it also wasn't something I needed to return to. The collapse had been slow, inevitable. A man who'd mistaken talent for immunity, who thought raw skill could outrun carelessness, who never understood that artistry is only one part of a business, the rest is built on trust, on delivery, on integrity. And so, quietly, the community stepped back from him. Not out of cruelty, but self-preservation. They stopped ordering. They stopped defending. And when he finally stopped showing up, they stopped asking where he was. What was left behind wasn't a rival. It was a warning. The following week, I received an email from the Wilderidge Bank. They were liquidating assets from the Alden workshop, tools, benches, storage units. The bank had a list. My name was on it. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I drove down to the lot. Most of the pieces were functional but worn planers, chisels, clamps. And there, half covered in a canvas tarp, was the maple drafting table I'd gifted Grayson on our first anniversary. I ran my fingers over the edge, worn smooth from use. He had carved our initials into the bottom corner, discreet and small, G&M. I bought it all. Not out of nostalgia. Not out of revenge. Because I knew how to breathe life into forgotten things. And because those tools didn't belong to the collapse, they belonged to the craft. Back at Hearth and History, Arden and Lila helped me unload the van. We set the tools on the back bench, cleaned them, labeled them. The drafting table went into the upstairs loft, where natural light pooled from the skylight. I stood there for a moment, watching dust swirl in the beam, and smiled. We weren't starting over. We were expanding. That same week, our commission calendar filled through the fall. A preservation group from New York had contacted us after reading the Ridgestyle article. They wanted to partner. I said yes. And as I turned out the studio lights one evening, I paused at the door and glanced across the street, where the Alden workshop once stood. Dark, empty, quiet. He said I'd never make it without him. But I had. Not by rising above the ashes of what he destroyed, but by building something that could never be burned down in the first place. Something rooted. Something true. Mine. The light through the studio windows had shifted. It always did in early spring, softer, more golden, stretching longer over the workbenches like it wanted to linger. I stood at the center of Hearth and History with my sleeves rolled and my hands deep in beeswax polish, smoothing the final layer across a Victorian writing desk destined for the Wilderidge Historical Museum. The grain shimmered beneath my palms, old walnut gleaming like it had just remembered what it was meant to be. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined this. Not because I didn't believe in myself, I always did, somewhere, but because grief has a way of clouding even the sharpest visions. I'd been fighting back shadows for so long, I forgot what the sun felt like when it wasn't a warning. Now, there were fresh voices echoing in the space. Not just Lila and Arden, who'd grown into their roles with confidence and grace, but two new apprentices, Theo and Calla. They came to me from the Wilderidge Design Academy with nothing but hunger in their eyes and calluses just beginning to form on their palms. I saw myself in them, hopeful, raw, ready. We didn't just teach them how to restore furniture, we taught them to restore intention. Theo was patient, drawn to delicate repair. He had a quiet reverence for old joints, always pausing before the first cut like he was asking permission. Calla was bolder, with a sharp eye for lines and a love for problem-solving. She once completely re-engineered a warped armoire drawer system and now carried a notebook full of diagrams and dreams. Together, we worked in rhythm. There was laughter, music, the occasional clatter of drop tools. But most of all, there was peace. We were more than a business now. We were a place people came to for care, for legacy, for work done by hands that listened. Our waitlist stretched into the new year. Clients traveled from 3 states away just to drop off pieces they'd inherited and almost given up on. We gave them hope, not flashy or fast, but honest and patient. The local expo was a blur of faces and applause. I hadn't planned to attend until the Wilderidge Historical Society personally invited me. "You're exactly what we want to celebrate," they'd said. Not just technique, but preservation. I brought Arden and Lila with me, dressed in simple linen, my hair pinned back with one of my mother's old combs. When they called my name for the Legacy Artisan of the Year award, I stood frozen for a moment, the breath caught in my throat. I thought of all the things I'd been called before: helper, decorative, secondary. And now this. Legacy. I didn't make a speech. Just nodded, accepted the plaque, and smiled as cameras clicked. Later that night, we celebrated with takeout and chamomile tea on the studio floor, surrounded by half-finished projects and open sketchbooks. It felt right. Not glamorous, but real. And then my phone buzzed. 17 missed calls. All from Grayson. I stared at the screen, watching the numbers blur into a block of static. No messages. No voicemails. Just call after call, like his desperation could somehow batter its way back into my life. I didn't feel panic. Not even anger. Just a quiet sadness, not for me, but for him. For the man who had once held beauty in his hands and let it rot from the inside out. I blocked the number. An hour later, my mother called. "He stopped by," she said gently. Unannounced. Looked awful. Said you ruined him. Said it was your fault. I sat down, resting the award in my lap like it weighed more than it did. "And what did Dad say?" Her voice softened. "He told him you broke it. She rebuilt it. Don't come back." I closed my eyes. That quiet validation, years in the making, settled into my bones like warmth. Not from triumph, but from peace. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't proving anything. I was simply living the truth. The next morning, I finished the desk. I ran my fingers across the ornate writing surface, its smooth curves whispering stories of letters once penned and secrets once tucked into drawers. We'd restored every inch, repaired the dovetails, replicated missing brass pulls, and matched the original shellac finish down to its amber glow. It was ready to return home, not as an artifact, but as a testament. This was my work now. Not salvaging what Grayson left behind. Not proving what I was worth, but honoring what remained, honoring what could still be loved. As I packed up the desk with Theo and Calla beside me, I caught my reflection in the glass of the studio door. The woman looking back at me was steady, her shoulders no longer braced for a storm. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of everything. He said I'd never make it without him. But this was mine, and I'd built it, restored it, by hand.